All right, we're doing the usual. What we do in the written stuff is different than what gets done orally. In fact, this time they're quite different. They start out at exactly the same point, but they diverge quickly, and they diverge significantly. Hi, Eva.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Were your ears burning?
No.
Okay.
All right. Now, what we have to offer in class may get sparse for a while, because I'm trying to put everything into getting ready for this trip that I'm doing. And it's just...
You're going?
Oh, yeah. There have been some difficulties that have arisen, but I'm going to be going anyway.
Oh, did you get one?
And I won't know what...
And then you
Thanksgiving Day.
can to the front.
Come back 1st of March. Yeah. Yeah, no, all over South America.
Surprising.
When are you going?
Thanksgiving Day.
Oh.
That's it. Yeah, everybody got them.
I've
They go to my
Libra.
Michael's developed the psychic powers, and he doesn't need to need them at all. He can just read them underneath it.
Leave it on the left.
Yeah.
Inner good? I don't know. I would have been told.
Everybody ready?
Let's start this off with a question.
Sure.
You probably won't want to answer, but that's all right. I was wondering, what you might look at in terms of health, like probably it relates because you probably look at the first, the ascendant maybe in the first house.
Ascendant, first house, and 6th house, but in general, I look over anything that's hot. That's how you learn. Like what we're doing here in class is pretty thorough. We're trying to cover everything, as much as possible. We won't get very far. But what I do is look over everything I can in a horoscope and see if there's something that jumps out at me as being significant to the circumstance. It usually always goes back to the ascendant in the 6th house.
And the first house.
I am.
And the first house, right?
Yeah,
The ascendant, right? Exactly. What do you mean by hot? Like say, really tight conjunctions and stuff?
No,
in
if
the
there's
chart,
something right at the time of the question. If
Oh.
somebody is having an illness and
Okay.
there's some kind of transit or some kind of something like that. All right, we're trying to do a major study every time or a minor study every time. And sometimes we repeat ourselves from other points of view. Like we did at least 2 and maybe 3 studies of an artist's aesthetic. Now when we looked at the Mohan Gandhi chart, we spoke about power and how he wielded power. Now we have another horoscope with Scorpio rising, so we're going to revisit looking at power another time. Now the rising sign represents more than just the physical body. It represents more than just early childhood. It represents a personality that's built right into the physical body. It gets developed in childhood, but it's like right within the flesh itself, you might say. It's designed to be that way. You look at the hands of an artist versus the hands of a bricklayer, you can see that my father was a plumber and he had huge, big hands. And you could see that this was a man that built a personality that was meant to work. It also represents what the personality has been conditioned to see, or what the personality chooses to see in the external world, and how it is seen, the actual perceptive process. Now with Gandhi rising, Gandhi looked out in the world and he saw discontent in the world. He saw people that were underclass and people that were being abused and they were discontented. And he saw how he could organize that discontent and transform it into something useful. And in his case, he transformed discontent into non-cooperation or into disobedience. Now, non-cooperation and disobedience seem to be pretty nice keywords for Scorpio rising. Simone de Beauvoir has Scorpio rising also. And what she saw were power struggles in the world. Now, in part, her childhood played into that. She was born into a family that was a conservative, lower middle class family. She herself became sort of an aloof, aesthetic, intellectual, cult figure, a left-winger. But despite that, she didn't escape the effects of the conservative childhood on her. She claimed that it was from educational principles and for educational ends. Even when France was under Nazi cooperation, she was both, and Sartre, her lover, were both, had to fight accusations of being Nazi sympathizers because they kept on working. They felt they wanted to keep on education no matter who was in power. The strong Saturn square Pluto aspect in this chart is very conservative. Now, the horoscope doesn't tell you what the political persuasion of the individual will be. There are conservative leftists, just like there are radical rightists. What the horoscope shows is the personal character, and what it gets applied to is something very different. Now, she would probably claim that everything that she did was practical and pragmatic, and to her it was practical and pragmatic. But in effect, many of her actions were quite conservative, and she was successful because of being conservative. Her mother was a strict conservative Catholic. Her father was a careful but skeptical, atheistic thinker, free thinker. So there was constantly a struggle of power from the earliest days of her childhood. So it's not surprising that she would develop a personality that would see power struggle in the world. She herself actually became an atheist, a materialist, and most important, a leading existentialist thinker. That still doesn't mean she outgrew the influences present in those very sensitive years of early childhood. Now, Sigmund Freud had Scorpio rising, and what he saw in the world was sex. Everything was stated in sexual terms. He saw sex as the most powerful force in the world. He saw the whole world in terms of sex. And the psychology that molded the social structure and the other factors in the world, he also saw in sexual terms. Well, give him a, yeah. Thank you. For Simone, sex, gender, yes, but not just gender. Sex played a large part in her life and in her philosophy. Scorpio is co-ruled by Pluto and Mars. In your fact sheet, you can see that both are moderate strength planets. They're not weak. They're certainly not strong. Pluto is a planet of power. And the power that is the power of Pluto is altogether different than the power of the sun. The sun is manifest power. It is expressed freely and totally. The sun gives it everything that it's got. It expresses without abridgment and without abatement. Sun shines, and if you don't like it, you can go and seek the shade, because the sun is not going to stop. Everything lives because of the power of the sun. And the sun, in some ways, seems to do it from our perspective as though it were playing. Pluto represents potential power. It influences without direct or manifest application. There's a very good example that I use repeatedly because it is such a perfect example. The potential power of Pluto, which works indirectly, is like the water that is behind a dam. It just seems to stand there doing nothing but providing an environment for fish and birds and things like that. But it is because of that standing presence that it can drive the dynamos. Because it stands up and the pressure gets higher and higher, the dynamos are driven. The greater the depth, the greater the power. It's almost ironic, as a lot of things with Scorpio are ironic, that its power in potential is greater than that of the sun, but it doesn't ever manifest it, and you never really know how great it is, but it is because of that non-assertion. It doesn't sap itself, and it's ever powerful. This is why in spiritual metaphysics, Pluto is said to rule the Father, and the Father is always invisible, because if it were to express itself as manifest light, it would no longer be the all-powerful Father. In this horoscope, Pluto's in the 7th house. So, many of the struggles are with a partner and or partners. It's clear that she would choose a Plutonian figure as a partner. Pluto is in Gemini, but Taurus is on the cusp of the 7th, and Venus, the ruler and depositor of Pluto, is in Aquarius, another fixed sign. The Gemini part indicates all kinds of minor twists and turns and all kinds of alternatives, but they are within a very fixed and set relational struggle. La, 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 la. One might say that when the ruler of the ascendant is in the 7th house, the key to the personality lies in the hands of the partner. Meaning to say, she's in his court, and he holds all the strings of power in the situation. The 7th house also indicates opportunities to be in touch with the individuality. Because of our lack of evolution at this time in the evolutionary process, we identify more with our personalities, with our dense bodies. We're materialistic. The relationship of our consciousness of the 1st house and the personality and the body and everything that goes with it to the 7th house, which is the unknown or the unseen individuality, is seen in the relationship of self and other. It is the other that is really the true part of us, but all we see as personality self, which isn't really a self, but we think it is. So it's not surprising that with the ruler of the ascendant in the 7th house and an identification with personality as self, with the body and its gender, that she would see women and herself personally as the other. So she sees the key to her personality is in that 7th house. So she sees women, and she identifies with her personality, the gender of it. She sees herself as the other. Now this is a major thesis. She wrote a book called The Second Sex, which revolutionized feminism. Even that wasn't her intent. It wasn't even written as a feminist book. But one of the major theses in there is that women are the other. They're never seen for themselves alone. They're seen as a convenient other.
And that's because the ruler of the ascendant is in the 7th?
Yes. She identifies herself personally with the other. Now, this notion of hers is also one of the keystones of the flavor of existentialism that she shared with Sartre. When it comes down to it, as their existentialism went, most of the things in the world cannot be mastered. They cannot be changed. And all that really counts is one's conscious relation to what's happening or what's coming at you. There were even solipsistic elements in their brand of existentialism. Everyone was alone, and all they had was their relationship to the world, and the only way you could express your being was in the conscious understanding of your relationship to the world. And the world was the other. Meaning to say then that one is in the hands of the other, and the only being that one has is in one's consciousness. We're going to go into this a lot more later on, especially when we get to the mentality, which will probably be in about 3 or 4 years. Now, it's a bit off topic, but since these are talks about spiritual astrology or mystical astrology, it's legal. So we're going to go for a paragraph's worth at least off a little.
When you existentialism is defined as
the philosophy of existence in the moment.
You said Mars is co-ruler, but
Yeah.
I guess you mostly focus on Pluto.
We're going to get to it, but it'll be way toward the end of the talk. This is one of those things, again, that will get very little done. We'll have a lot of fun doing it. And we'll do it okay, but we won't get it all done. And, all right. Now, if instead of identifying with our personality, and we identify with ourself as the focus of and the focus within the universal spirit, then the selfness of that universal spirit of which we are a focus, the selfness from which we derive the quality of our selfhood, is the infinite other. That is to say, we know ourselves and we know there's something of ourself, and if we see it in relation to the universal spirit, especially the first layer up, which is called the life spirit, then we see ourself relative to the selfness, but the selfness is the same selfness for every other self-conscious being in the cosmos. So that selfness is the selfness that is the other, the self. So this philosophy that she deals with in a materialistic existentialism has a counterpart in spirituality. That selfness is the source of altruism. That is a universal love that is shared by all. And it's a love that transcends self. So it's a change of focus from self-seeking and from self-interest to the infinite other. In some schools of philosophy, it's called the beyond self. In modern Rosicrucian Christian mysticism, we believe that in the state that we are in now, in evolution, all of our waking consciousness is in interplay between the self, which is sometimes called the human spirit, and that other, the life spirit. And that we awaken to that consciousness through the reflection of those two states in the world around us. The vegetative state of life and the motive state of emotion and desire. So all of our consciousness is between the self and the other. Now what's really fascinating about all of this is that when one transfers one's attention from the self to the life spirit, or to beyond the self, it is a surrender. It is a surrender to that altruistic love that always wins, but just like in her existentialism, it always wins by losing. So it's a surrender to a life of surrender. Doesn't mean that the self is gone, it just means that one looks at things from the perspective of the all rather than from the self. And it doesn't mean an inability to be practical in this world. It just means that one is practical with regard to the all, to the other. What is even more fascinating about this is that the spiritual correlative to her brand of existentialism is that when there is a surrender to the infinite other, to the life of surrender, that is seen as the spiritual feminine. And it is sometimes referred to as the divine mother. The divine mother of imagination, which always surrenders or sacrifices to the will of the divine spirit. It's feminine in that sense. All right. But it's fascinating how the same ideas can be present on different levels. I'm sure that if the common notion of things were as they were, she would turn over in her grave hearing this. But maybe she's had a conversion on it. She isn't right. Back to Simone. Now what's interesting with all of this in regard to Simone is that Simone surrendered. And when she surrendered, it wasn't a servile or a slavish surrender, but she saw no reason to demonstrate mastery over Sartre. But in effect, and in the essential ways of life, which were not seen by the world, maybe they weren't even seen by Sartre, she did master. She won by losing. Now, there is now, if you look through the papers, now that both people have passed on, that many of the basic elements of Sartre's existentialism were written by her first. He published first, but they were written by her first. And it didn't make any difference to her. In fact, she liked the idea about that by surrendering the celebrity and surrendering the power, that she was free from a lot of the difficulties. It wasn't until The Second Sex was published that she had all of those social difficulties. In fact, for her, it wasn't a sacrifice. This wasn't like a woman sacrificing for her man or some of that kind of baloney. This was a statement of existential philosophy. If all that really matters is the consciousness of the individual to the greater reality in the existential moment, the struggle for supremacy doesn't do anything. It's just a waste of effort. If you put everything into the experience of the moment, that's what counts. Besides, if you do become active in that way, it's you become part of the workings of the greater reality in an ironic way that the existentialists understood very well. Not a lot of people here have read a lot of existentialism. We won't go into a lot of that. You look like you got a question.
Well, yeah, but I was going to pass on it until later.
Okay. Now, The Second Sex, which is the book that she's most famous for, was not written as a feminist thesis. It wasn't written as a polemic. It was written as an existentialistic exploration of women in the order of things, so that one could be conscious of oneself in that order of things. And the big thesis in it is the making of women as the other, as seen in the eyes of the world, which are the masculine-oriented society. It does deal with the marginalization and the casting of women into an insignificant role, but it doesn't so much shake a finger at the gross unfairness, but it looks at it almost with an existential inevitability. It does not deal with the fact that in her personal struggle, she wielded more power, even though philosophically that was meaningless. She might lose her edge and her existential stance in life if you took notice of that too much. It might have been a little bit of self-lying. It might have been a existential philosophy, but it's very interesting that you took that stance. This is the indirect manner which, or the outlook indicated by Pluto as it reacts in relational structure from the seventh house. Doesn't mean that things cannot be accomplished by intention. That's the way Pluto accomplishes things, by intention, by indirect influence, by pressure, by will, by threat of imminent inevitability. All of those are things that Pluto uses to accomplish things. So even with the little bit that we've looked at Pluto in the seventh house as it rules the ascendant, we can see that she was in something very complex, something that was very indirect and direct, and then on another level indirect again. It's one of those things. And the applications of power occurred as if she were not trying to fly. With the fourth house being involved, Pluto squares all of the planets in the fourth house, not so much the moon, but she squares the planets in the fourth house. She may not have been as completely existentially aware and in active participation as she thought. She herself probably had a lot of unconsciousness in her. Scorpio itself can be like that. It's something I've had to deal with all of my life. If you find me teasing or joking or flirting or doing something like that, I don't know whether I'm serious or not. Scorpio is like that. It's always itself on the edge of its own inner darkness. Taurus is probably the most fixed sign of all of the signs. So with its being on the cusp of the house containing Pluto, it gives almost a feeling of certainty or eternality. The funny thing is, she never married Sartre. They were verbally committed to each other as the only significant or meaningful necessary being to each other. That's the way they referred to each other, that they would have each other only as the one necessary being to each other. They maintained it their whole life like that. Now this feeling, especially with Taurus on the cusp of materialistic certainty, that's the whole basis of existentialist philosophy that she and Sartre developed together. However, it was not the chief source. To get at the chief source, we have to look at an aspect analysis, but we're not going to do the full analysis tonight because we can't. We're going to look at the second strongest aspect in the horoscope. Saturn square Pluto.
The interesting thing here, Richard, is you were talking about the seventh house being the other, and the fact that they never got married, but they referred to each other as the significant other.
Yeah.
What did you say again about Taurus being on the cusp of the seventh?
It gives a feeling of certainty or inevitability. I'm not sure I would like to be known as an inevitability in somebody's life. I'd like to be a little bit more endeared than that. That's the way we're taught today.
It's interesting that the first and the seventh house are associated by all those aspects in that club.
Yes, that's what we're doing all night is we're looking at that cluster of aspects. In fact, the Mars-Pluto is covered more in the written than it is. Okay. Both Saturn and Pluto, we could see, are medium-strength planets. But the aspect is quite good. Sort of like a radio connection that's very strong between two people that don't have a whole lot to say to each other. It's not quite like that, but you can see what I mean. The connection is good, but the strength from either side is not strong. The relationship is good. Players may not be real strong. And it's sort of like two mediocre people tied or hooked up to a tool that is stronger than either has the capacity to utilize. So you've got something there that's more than you can really use. So something like two people using a measuring device which is more accurate and exacting than either of them can understand. One of the things that's interesting about this combination is that neither planet is personal. The Sun, which represents self, and Mercury, which represents my mind, and Venus, which represents my feelings, and the Moon are considered personal planets, all of the inner planets. So what we're talking about here is a force that is an imponderable activity, and every bit of it is beyond the ken and the ability of the native to understand it. That's the way it works with aspects of planets that are all external, that are all outer planets. They are something that is, yes, they might work in your consciousness, but they're not something that you personally can get your hands on. This means that activities or direct action of any kind will never be taken through this aspect alone. It will have to come to sidelong aspects with personal planets. In this case, the Moon is the only truly personal planet. The Moon becomes important here. We won't get a chance to go into that tonight. In this regard, then, the sidelong aspect relative to this major attitude are something like contingent relationships. And this is what the life between Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir was like. They had this one locked-in relationship, but they both had contingent lovers on the side. Quite a few side-one lovers. We started getting to the juicy stuff. This is a very juicy night as far as scandalous things. So already, just as far as we've looked at the Saturn square Pluto, it already sounds like a dark existential inevitability. In fact, Saturn and Pluto are the two most dark planets of all the whole string of planets. So this is, with this square, it's sort of like two very dark figures struggling or wrestling or deadlocked with each other in a struggle, and that struggle is completely in the dark, and they're locked into it, they're engaged, and they can't disengage. So there's like, you can see what kind of an attitude toward the cosmos having this being a real strong aspect in one's life can produce. Now both Saturn and Pluto are control planets, but each controlled in a different way and for different reasons. Saturn wants sensible material ends, objectives, and sometimes all the trappings that go with them. Saturn seeks control, but often it's because it's insecure. And then the control becomes manipulation. Saturn is slow, it's painstaking, it's careful, it's cold, it's patient, and it never quits. Pluto, in relation to power, wants the whole ball of wax. It wants all the marbles. It doesn't care whether there are trappings except that they're part of the total. It isn't ever insecure. It can be guilty, but it isn't ever insecure. It wills. Or, on another level, it desires that the whole business happen, and it doesn't quit till it does happen. In regard to what we're looking at here between the houses, both would rather work for others. Saturn would rather work for others to have the power as an objective, but it's safer if you work for others, because then other people further down the line or the administrative chain or the chain of command are the ones that get hit. Pluto just prefers letting everybody else do the busy work because it doesn't want to dissipate its ultimate divine power by having to directly administer. So we see a very dark inevitability. It's a struggle to box things in or to contain things in. Saturn has the quality of fate, of determinism, of a law that never fails because cause is always followed by effect. Pluto has the quality of always being unseen. It's almost an arbitrary power. It can't be denied, it can't be explained, it can't be anything like that. It just very, very hangs on with that kind of power. Now these two planets are in common signs. And the common sign placement is like a middle state. Common signs are called common signs because they're common to the seasons that precede and succeed them. Gemini is common to both spring and summer. Virgo is common to both summer and fall. And that kind of middle state between the more determined states has a quality about it of being an agent or being vicarious carries things out for others, or others carry things out through it. So the way this aspect works out, it makes it feel like it's being carried out through an agency. And it adds to the removed kind of feeling. Moreover, the common signs deal with things that have a lot to do with thought, either abstract or concrete, whether it's the Jupiterian common signs or the material common signs. So the common signs has something of a very hypothetical or theoretical, unengaged feeling about them, which is one of the reasons why sometimes the common signs have a hard time enduring and carrying things out. And if you put all of these things together and read some of the writings, especially the novels of Simone de Beauvoir, you get this kind of feeling of existential reality from them. If you look at the time when she was born, it was the time of indecision and an undecided war that developed out of this time. The First World War, it was a dark, heavy, gloomy war that nobody ever really won. And the views of the time were very materialistic and mechanistic. It was a time of indecision. It was a time when the old religious faith couldn't stand up to the new mechanistic scientific rigor. And mysticism was just too much of a leap of faith for most people. Now, we can't do a full analysis of this because I don't really have enough experience with Saturn-Pluto aspects that I can say that, when one is stronger, this is the case, and the other is stronger, this is the case. I haven't seen enough so I can say that. But we have enough of a sense of the aspect so that we can see why they chose to recommence their evolutionary work by being reborn at this time. And you can see the philosophy that came out of it. It was just as stale and standoff as the World War itself was. Now, we've said quite a few times now that the seventh house is the house of the other. And that is usually an intimate partnership. Or it's some kind of co-experience of life, as in a marriage. The fourth house is the intimate home life, the very familiar and personalized environment. You make your private room your personalized place. It's also even more personal basement of the character. It's like the personal subconscious. You've got all kinds of mice and things like that running around out in the basement. I don't live in the basement. What does that say about me? Yes.
Just a question while I think of it. With both Pluto and Mars being co-ruler of Scorpio, in this case, why is not Pluto ruler of the first house?
Because they're co-rulers. They both are intimately tied into it.
I mean, because it's your sheet just shows as
the sheet shows very clearly that Mars is number 4, the fourth strongest planet, whereas Pluto is number 7. It is number 5. It's not as strong as Mars. It's close, but it's not at all as strong.
Oh, okay. I mean,
we'll talk more about the Mars in the written than in the.
Okay.
I've never seen it in co-rulerships that one completely blots out the other. I've never seen it.
I was just curious.
And it's very rare that Pluto is really strong in a chart anyway. All right, now I've lost my place now.
You were in the basement.
Yeah.
You were in the basement. Personal subconscious.
Yeah.
And mice are in the
She is.
Have you ever seen like people who go, let's say, square Saturn to be like really blocked in life, like the real heaviness that somehow their things just really get out of their way and they can't.
there is that there, but I have, in my practical experience and in my reading both, like reading people's lives and such, I don't have a lot of experience that I can say how it always works. So that's why I'm trying to stick very, very carefully with how it works for its known and not how it works for everyone.
Yeah, I just had a friend that had a really tough.
Okay. Now when we deal with the kind of intimacy that is the fourth house kind of intimacy, we have to not only look at the abstract personal effect of this aspect, but we have to see how it acted out personally in the character, which is the introduction and now the dicey stuff. All right. A few moments ago, we talked about the stymied psychic atmosphere surrounding World War I. It's possible that the effects of that could enter into the individual life, the more intimate personal life, directly. That does happen. But in most instances, when what is happening out in the world becomes part of the intimate life, it usually comes into the 12th house. This outer planet influence of Saturn and Pluto that we are examining has much more effect in the 4th house. So we would expect something much more personal and not so much how the greater world sneaked into the personal living. When Saturn square Pluto influence enters directly into the personality, its influence usually indicates repression, especially boxed in like this. With the direct 4th house activity, with Saturn being in the 4th house, repression is even more likely. Now, repression often occurs when a person is trying to live up to some external standard of values which may or may not be relevant to one's evolutionary status. If thoughts and desires, especially desires, cannot be molded to that external standard, or what that external standard is perceived to be, there is often an attempt to hold the thoughts back. This is like saying if the external standard is a moral system of a religion and you can't live up to them, up to that standard, what do? Rather than do the best that you can and direct things as you can, you try to hold back the things. You try to push down the things that you can't control. You're not living up to what you believe is right. Now, at this point, it's suppression. And if it's temporary, and if one doesn't lose conscious awareness of the fact that something is being held back or held down, it's not repressed. However, if a person persists and loses touch with the psychic content, that's when somebody gets into trouble. Thoughts and desires are living things, much more alive than our bodies are. Moreover, since they're subtle, they are more powerful. They're closer to the spirit. They are living forces ultimately precipitated out of spirit. Their purpose, they are intended to move the inertial personality, to move us into action, and out of that action we have experience. And they're meant to interpret that experience. So they're motivational and interpretive, the thoughts and desires that we have. We get a feel for things, or we understand things when we've acted with them. Now, if we repress thoughts and desires and they're forgotten, it does not mean that they die. They actually become stronger, as most things do that are repressed. Given a free rein by not being watched or transformed into something else, they sort of fester like things in water that it just stands there until they become unrecognizable in their form from what they were when they were consciously known about. It's something analogous to what happens when you take sedimentary rock and push it down so far that it becomes metamorphic rock. It changes into something else, but chemically it's still the same. The fantasy, imaginative transformation that is involved with the thoughts and desires changing appearance is what is hinted at by the Pisces in the 4th house, especially the moon in Pisces in the 4th house.
What is hinted at?
What?
What would you say was hinted at?
That represents normally if we're progressing forward and we're reaching toward evolutionary standards, we use the imagination to accomplish things. But when we can't live up to things and we start repressing, then we use the imagination in a fanciful way, in a fantasy way. We live in fantasies of one kind or another, or we just give the imagination free rein with the repressed material, and it comes out as all sorts of exotic kinds of things. And those exotic kinds of things are what are pointed to with Pisces in the 4th house. Dreams are often expressions of the fantasy life of an individual. The dreams can be many other things. Okay?
Do you think like her writing?
No. We're coming to the way.
How did her?
Yeah. Eventually, because living things like thoughts and desires cannot be repressed forever, they usually rise to the surface again. And when they do, it's usually more forceful. Only now it's disguised, and it's still not tamed, or it's still not regenerated in one way or another. And as you can see, that means trouble, usually big trouble. For Simone, it did not mean really big trouble. She was not psychopathological. She did not have repression hysteria. She didn't have hallucinations like the severely repressed women that Freud and other late Victorian psychiatrists dealt with. That wasn't the case with her. However, she did have an unpleasant, uncontrolled behavior which she would not acknowledge even when it became public evidence, or when evidence of it became public. Now, all of what we just said about repression is astrologically expectable. The square is quite strong. Planets are not. So there is a clear-cut mode of activity that is frequently chosen, but it's not overwhelming. It's not a mechanistic materialism. So the quotient of the whole pattern is not overly strong. If you had two strong planets and a strong aspect, then the quotient of the whole pattern would be very strong. It's dark enough and heavy enough that it is fatalistic, and it has her mechanistic, materialistic outlook on life. So it was strong enough to produce existentialistic attitude and philosophy. And with Pisces, involved. It's possible that even some of the Roman Catholic influences were involved, because she didn't become an atheist until she was 16. And by that time, all of the die was already struck that the Catholic Church was going to have on her. So somewhere deep down in the Christian subconscious, she had that kind of sensitivity. Now, how this is all worked out in her life is fascinating. Because Scorpio is involved, it's ironic. It's pretty obvious, and it's pretty obvious to see something from without. From within, it isn't always so obvious. Now, Saturn and Pluto are the repressing agencies. Mars, the other co-ruler of Scorpio, and the Moon, which always has a stake in the personality because it rules the whole intrauterine period when that personality is being built in the womb. Those two planets are what is being repressed. Now, this is a really simple pattern, the way it lays in this chart. This is an excellent textbook chart because of it. It is so simple. Now, the Moon and Mars are planets of emotionality. So what is repressed is not so much thoughts, but it is emotions and desires. Astrologically speaking, they usually represent primitive emotions, instincts, desires, lusts, natural functions, and things of that nature. Usually when the Moon and Mars are in aspect with each other, the expression of those kinds of things is frank, it's candid, it's unrestrained, it's considered natural. Your basic urges and desires, you just release them. That's the way it normally goes. Now, to some extent, because she had this aspect, she was passionately fluid. Passionally fluid. Her passions flowed quite regularly. All right. Like many with Scorpio rising, she had a pretty heavy sexual appetite and wanted to express it freely. However, since Saturn and the Moon do like such fluent expression, it doesn't take much of repression to turn them into something else. What I'm trying to say is that they're such, when the two of them are together, they don't want any restraint. They're really fluent and they want to be out there right away. And any amount of repression causes them to change right away. It's sort of like if you have a really juicy plum or something like that, that juicy plum is going to go spoiled. And it's going to turn much more quickly than if you have something like a winter melon or something that's, that's not so juicy like that, but does it in a different way. So they're quickly turned by the imagination. The image that I get of the Moon and Mars modestly repressed in Pisces is something like having a wild animal dressed in doll's clothes. Like taking a wild tomcat and putting it in Dolly's clothes. Yes.
I've forgotten what you said. What causes the repression here now?
Saturn and the Pluto.
The Saturn and the Pluto. Okay.
It exists by clamping down on things.
All right. So the one question then that I had when you were talking about imagination, is it the fourth house that
the Moon and Pisces are the imaginative factors. Yes.
In this case.
In this case, it's very clear.
Right.
It's a very clear, direct, simple case. In some horoscopes, it isn't this simple.
What I'm asking though is, if you had a different set of planets there, would the imagination still be there, but it'd be a different type?
Yes. And sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it isn't quite that simple. Sometimes the imagination is in another part of the character that is more clearly manifest. This is a textbook simple example. It's as simple as we can get. Okay. The way the fourth house works into this is very fascinating. Now, in past weeks and in past classes, we've looked at the fourth house as indicating opportunities to be in touch with the personal subconscious. We've also at other times looked at the fourth house as an indicator of opportunities to solve personal problems. In other occasions, we've looked at it as home life. We've even looked at it as representing the indirect parent, the parent who doesn't do the direct disciplining but works through the other, the boogeyman parent. But there is a side of the fourth house that I can't remember going into in any of the past classes, and so it's about time to do that. And that has to do with the basic horizontal and vertical relationships. We touched on it briefly when we looked at the angles when we were doing testing and profiling. We said that the angular houses, the first, the fourth, the seventh, and the 10th houses, showed more acute or accentuated opportunities, early childhood opportunities, or the spouse, or the profession, or the nest. They're very close, acute opportunities. Now, the line that forms from the cusp of the first and seventh houses is the horizon. When we're treading on the horizon, we're on the level. It's even. There is no higher, there is no lower. It's all on an even level plane. We talk about when they call leveling the playing field. Now, as we saw earlier, the first and seventh house horizon indicates the me and you relationship of the personal self to the indirect other self, or the individuality to the personality. The line that forms the fourth and 10th houses represents basic vertical relationships. When one is directly on the vertical, one is either rising straight up or sinking straight down. In the past, we have talked about the 10th house as indicating the influence of bosses or superiors or beings that are over us in authority in some kind of scale of some kind or another. It doesn't make any difference whether you're a big muck-a-muck at the local golf course or whether it's the United States government. We've not spoken of the fourth house influences as influences with those below us. They are the people below us in the stations of life and in the chain of authority. They could be like fifth house children or students, and they could be like sixth house servants or patients. But what is important with the fourth house is not the activity, but the position, the fact that they are below us. Now, a few minutes ago, we noted that she didn't mind being subsidiary to Sartre. She found it an excellent place from which to struggle and to wield power without the drag of notoriety or popularity or anything like that. In some ways, her fourth house relationship with Sartre was something like a lifelong ambush. She was ambushing him from below. Her relationship with those under her was quite another matter, and it was every bit as camouflaged and hidden from her as her relationship with Sartre. It's all a matter of whether you're looking at her relative to her partner or someone above her, and she was then quite conscious of the fact that she was in the lower position. But when there were people below her, she wasn't so conscious of them. And this is the very nature of the fourth house relationship. It is those things that become unconscious personally in our lives, like the things that get pushed down into the subconscious, whether they're suppressions or repressions. Now, Simone had quite a few people directly under her. Some of them were students. Some of them were literary, philosophical, or feminist acolytes. Almost all of them were women. And quite a few of them, not hundreds, by my standards, quite a few of them she seduced. Now, at this juncture, bisexuality is not the issue. What we're trying to get at is the fourth house relationship. You lead right into the juicy part. Hug Karuna for me. Hug Garish for me. That? So we're looking at the fourth house and the relationship with those below us and how it functions in its unconscious nature. Now, in her writings about gender and the power relationship between men and women in society, she makes the point that women are second-class citizens. The whole society is structured so that women are and always will be the underclass. Her point is that you can be born a slave and be free. But if you're born a woman, you're always going to be a woman. As long as you're the other, you're going to be put into the lower case. Of course, if you can see things with the scope of mysticism, you can see that it's not wise to identify with the gender or to become attached to it, because the spirit, which is the essential being, is beyond all of that. It's male and female and much more. And she could just as soon be born next time around a male as a female. So it's a non-issue there. One does the best that one can with the circumstances that one is reborn to, and then moves on to something else. What we're doing and saying here is not intended as a criticism of her. It's meant as a study and nothing more. Now, it's fascinating how double-bodied Gemini and Pisces produced such bipolar extremes. In the second sex, she repeatedly makes the case that woman is always the underclass and subservient. She's given the leadings. What's ironic about all of this is that in her life with Sartre, she used that situation to take advantage of it. What is also ironic is that when she was in the upper position, she wielded power over those in the same way, according to her liking. Now, this is not an indictment of her, but it's a statement of how the vertical application of power works. You become unconscious of what is below you. It's always, servants know this. That the people who they work for will say everything right in front of them because they're the servants and they're below and you don't even think they're people. And when she was in the position where she had these people under her, she used them, and she used them for her sexual lusts, and she didn't even really know that she was doing that. She didn't even think of it in terms of that same way. So it's a big statement about the unconscious nature of the lower pole in the vertical and how it works. Now, this is a principle that works in many ways. An individual who is abused by an adult when in childhood often abuses other children as an adult. That's the nature of the vertical. It's misused as it's misused in our state of evolution. It is the undeveloped and unimpressible psychic organism of a child that when it has this relationship forced on it, it's unconscious of the fact that this content is being put into it. It's being pushed into a personal subservience. It's in effect, when there is an abuser of the child, which is certainly an above-below relationship, it is an external kind of repression. In the immature child psyche, it's likely to conceive that this is what love is like. This is what it's like with an overling. And then when that child becomes an adult and supposedly mature, it wants to act out of love, but because it's unconscious of all of the images in the way that things work out, as they're repressed into the subconscious, that's how it sees things. So that's the nature of the lower vertical. Now this principle has all kinds of fascinating ramifications in spiritual things, but unfortunately we don't have the time to go into cosmology, so we'll have to wait for a spiritual philosophy class in a few years. Now, we have to be very careful and very, very certain that we state that we do not think that Simone was seduced or abused as a child or anything like that. I don't see any such indications in the horoscope, which would be more from the first house to the fourth house. We're only, when we're giving these examples about children who are abused, we're only using that as an example. It's obvious that her life was not as severe as that as an abused childhood. It's just here a mild repression of herself, and it's very much a philosophical matter to her. Since Pluto has a hand in this, and since Pluto is the co-ruler of both the 12th house and the first house, it's likely that this whole repressed behavior is probably a carryover from an immediate preceding past life. That is to say, in the rebirth before this one, when you find connections when the same sign is on the 12th house as it is on the first house, that's a sign usually of immediate carryover, that something got right really quick and you had to take care of it right away. Now, one instance of this behavior, this seductive behavior of which she was unconscious or somewhat unconscious, reveals some other aspects about this pattern and all kinds of other ironies, and it's really interesting. Around 1939, she seduced a young woman and eventually brought the young woman into a 2-year menage with Sartre. The business, many years later, eventually became a public scandal and even a dispute. And it was a literary philosophical dispute because the young woman was a good writer and she did a book on the whole thing from her point of view. And it was quite an extreme book because she was held down and abused, and not seriously, but it's serious enough.
What was that?
By them?
What book was that?
You can find it. You can find it on the net.
Well,
And all of the, there's more to, let me get the Jesus. Boy, this is a voyeuristic class. Everybody
Just want to know everything.
inquiring mind, so you can know.
Now, when this book came out, and the whole business of her behavior with a lot of women came out, Simone denied everything. She thought all the letters that she sent to Sartre had been lost or destroyed. And eventually the letters came out, and you can get the letters. And they were even published. So Simone even still persisted then, but eventually she never admitted, eventually all she did was keep a very pregnant silence. And
Choice of words.
yeah, yeah.
Now, one other question. What in this chart would indicate the homosexual tendency?
I don't go into that now. We will go into that probably when we get to emotionality. There's a whole bunch of things.
Yeah, there's a lot of connections to beautiful chart.
Yes, it is. All right. Now, this matter is worth going into a little more. Now, the moon and Mars are considered primitive or young or immature when you see them from an abstract scale of planetary evolution. At the top of that scale, you have planets like Neptune and Uranus. They are, highly spiritual, multi-talented, creative, and all of those kinds of things. But the Moon and Mars are biological almost, just primitive. If they indicate an immature nature in the horoscope, as they do here, that immaturity doesn't grow when it isn't given experience. That is to say, when you repress something, and it's an immature force that is repressed, when it comes out of repression, it isn't suddenly going to have gotten mature. It's going to remain as immature as when it was repressed. Because the way we mature is through active experience. You make mistakes, and from those mistakes, the truth sinks into you, and you grow by that. Now, when things are repressed, they may metamorphose into all sorts of shapes, but all of those shapes will be as mature as the force that is being metamorphosed. Now, when these letters surfaced, they contained all kinds of clever and sophisticated but immature references to body parts. It was, like Scorpio gets involved with body parts. There were even characterizations of people according to body types and all kinds of other immature behavior. The immaturity illustrates that fact about repression. But that's not even what we're looking into. It's an interesting thing to mention along the way, but that's not what we're trying to get at. It's not even ironic. Even the juxtaposition of the immaturity with all of the maturity of the rest of her character isn't really ironic. It's kind of a little shocking, but it isn't really ironic. What is ironic is that one of the main themes for her work about the degeneration of women, which she herself did, was that degradation of women was done by objectifying them. That is, turning them into objects and body parts into objects. Now, I haven't read the books and the letters, but the consensus of the reviewers, and I read mostly female reviewers, is that the whole business was pretty degrading. In fact, somebody even made a moderately medium-low class movie about it called 8.5 Days, on the degradation of the woman through becoming a sexual object, and was taken directly from this instance. It was the objectifying of body parts in bodies that was ironic. And the funny thing about it is that was even unconscious. It's amazing that the whole personality, she could see how these things work in society, but when it came into her own fourth house and her own activities of that kind, she couldn't see it then. That's the kind of irony that is involved. There's a second irony, and that is an illustration of the fact that women are not always under the wheels of some kind of deterministic existential juggernaut, but they themselves can do the same thing. If you're looking for astrological symbols, the way she saw the other as objectified, the Taurus is on the cusp of the seventh house. And Taurus is the sign that objectifies more than any other sign. So what we're talking about here is the objectifying of the other. Moreover, of the sun and the strongest planet in the chart, Mercury, which is talked about more in the written brief, are in the second house. And her identity is therefore as an object. I had the sun in the second house too. I identified it being a sex object. There's no more talk about it.
I thought that was your picture on the cover.
I I have my own ironies.
Pretty good camouflage.
It's not a wise thing to judge things like this because they're ongoing things. And it's difficult to say what any of us would do if all the restraints that are on us were lifted from us and we had all the freedom we wanted and all the liberty we wanted and we were also empowered. There's probably a reason that we don't have all of that freedom and that we don't have miraculous powers because we're not ready for them yet because we ourselves might be in the same kind of position. I can, it's not hard for me to see that. In my younger years, I was popular with a lot of young people, and there were times that my behavior was not the best. Yes.
In her unconscious objectification, would that have changed in her personal life if she had had any one particular planet in the first house aspecting those others?
I think even without astrological influences, somebody had just pointed it out to her. She did like Freud, and she studied Freudianism, but she never took it to heart in her own life, and she never did an analysis of things going on in her own unconscious.
So,
But an aspect to the first house or any aspect outside that could give a clear waking consciousness could have done it. This is a pretty deadlocked, and it's a dark thing. This is so shadowy. That's why this is so hard. There even aren't all kinds of, because she's so materialistic, it didn't take all kinds of flowery imagination, and it wasn't like that. It was held down, and it was held in the dark. It's very hard to see it. That's the part of it.
But the reason I asked that question is because even when it was pointed out, you say according to the letters and made public, she was still saying, not me, not me.
Yeah, she tried to deny it, yes. And I think my guess is, though I can't say for certain, it would have been a sophisticated argument that she would have used, but I think if really pressed to it, what she would have said, this isn't what was intended. I was just playing and having a little fun, which is ironically the same argument that men use when they seduce women and put them under them in that same kind of way. I'm just having a little fun. Boys will be boys. Okay.
would that be the Pluto and Gemini in the 7th?
What?
Would that be the Pluto and Gemini excuse in the 7th?
I don't know. I didn't really look into the excuses, so I don't have an answer to that. Now, hopefully, the only reason I went into this, I don't like to go into it necessarily. Yes, there has to be something a little word once in a while to keep interest, but who's that isn't why we went into this. The reason we went into this is to understand her and obviously to be able to see the very tricky and the very subtle nature of the psychological mechanisms that are involved, because they work in us just like they do in her. Her horoscope, the wheel isn't any different than us. The 12 signs aren't any different. The 10 planets aren't any different. They have maybe different configurations, but we're in the same universe. And this is all I have time to prepare. I hope to go into a cosmological probe of that, but I didn't get a chance to. And I tried to go into hope to go into other aspects of personality, but when I got involved with power and all the ironies of power and some of the abuses of power and how they work psychologically, that's as far as I can get. Some of the things we hope to get into next, in future times, we come back to this horoscope.
Plus at the end of the 45 minutes.
Next time we're going to look at the personality of Herman Hesse.
So if you had, transiting Saturn square natal Pluto, then, and let's say natal Pluto is in a strong, let's say opposite the sun in a chart, then you're kind of likely to have power struggles or something, right?
Yes, but when it's Saturn, in either one of those planets can produce power struggles at any time. But when it is Saturn and Pluto, it's very dark. And there's a quality of invisibility. The father figure, like Pluto in Greek mythology, wore what is called in Norse mythology the Tarnhelm, and it gave him the power of invisibility. when he had that helmet on, he couldn't be seen. And, when somebody throws a fast or a tricky pitch at you, they call it the dark one because you can't see it. It is that quality of invisibility. All of the octave planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, have a quality of invisibility about them, but Pluto's is more like from a quality of darkness and from lack of experience or even lack of capability of experience in the realm from which Pluto is operating in the soul.
I'd like to go back to my last question, and that was, you pointed out well that it was this aspect between these two impersonal planets and where they were located in the houses which presented the opportunities, and that it was that the fourth house that put it in the subconscious that she was not aware of it, and that it was, she saw it in the others but could never see it in herself. And that's why I asked the question, if the first house is the house of self, if anything in the fourth house would then, especially one of the personal planets, would have been aspected to any one of those two.
No, I don't think that is enough to do it itself. Because the first house is usually the source of the content that ends up in the fourth house. It is from the personality that we have personal perceptive experiences, and when they get personalized and subjectified, they then become the content, whether it's gross or whether it's usable in the person's subconscious. So the first house is the most common source for materials in the fourth house. And the phenomenon of projection always works in psychological things. If you're not owning up to something and you're not living up to something, you will see in the external world exactly what you have pre-programmed yourself to see in the external world. In the seventh house, it is a tendency to blame the other, because the seventh house is the transference where you take unconscious content and project it onto somebody who is acting as a Koepsel or as the other. But just having something in the first house itself is not enough. It's something like the blindness that we talked about. An example of what you're trying to say, I can give you an example that says, no, that doesn't work. Because if you are in a psychological state of consciousness where you're thinking of loss, the item that you're looking for can be right in front of you. But if you're in a mindset that you're not seeing it, that object will be right in front of you, be right in your first house, and you still won't see it. It requires an exercise of consciousness. And as far as I can see, this is not a very edifying statement about the nature of humanity. But for us to become aware of things, especially things that we're stonewalling on, and this is Saturn Pluto is certainly a stonewalling aspect, it requires some kind of painful experience. And what rebounded in her and rang in her when it became scandalous and the letters came out must certainly have been that experience that brought it to attention. I don't think that anybody is intelligent as she is and that has that many insights into the nature of things, that when she had the facts of her own existence and how much they were ironically contradictory to what she saw in the world, I can't see that you would have to have taken that to heart. And that's the kind of experience that changes things. And if you see how childish sexuality is, and how you use it as a plaything, and, she was well in her years when they started coming off to the surface. And, and she had a wonderful review of life. She had started to experience a lot of other things beyond knowledge and things like that. And so that it had that kind of experience had to be the kind of thing that influenced the mind of you. I think it's one of the things of nature that the spirit that is in us doesn't let us get away with anything, and eventually we have to go up to everything and deep experiences that we need to go up.
Humbling, humiliating ones.
Yeah.
So if Pluto would be a planet that would bring forth guilt, right? If a person feels really guilty about things, would it also be would that be one of the key words of Pluto would be guilt?
Yes.
Is there any other planet?
No, I think Pluto is probably the most involved.
But not Saturn.
No. Saturn is too honestly pulled in a different perspective. Guilt is remorse indulged. Remorse is helpful. And if you indulge yourself, because you can write, if you're a desire-bounding person, all desires feel good. And, some people like the desire of energy, so much so that they like to get angry because they like that feeling of desire. And it's possible that some people, there's some inverted people, that they indulge in remorse. There have been people, a famous person of such a nature, somebody who went through all of that and actually outgrew it, was a Scorpio, and that was Dostoevsky. And he did sinful things because he loved to indulge in remorse. Eventually he grew out of it, which is really quite a thing, because that's a high degree of indulgence. When you can take the thing that is supposed to correct indulgences and indulge yourself in it, that's a pretty perverse kind of practice.
That's irony.
You had a question.
What, yeah, you just said you ran it that Pluto and Neptune had a quality of invisibility, but the Pluto's quality of invisibility is particularly dark.
Yes. Unseen, unknown, seems to come out of nowhere. All right. It's been a very good night. Maybe you should have taken charts like Gypsy Rose Lee or something like that and done a whole class on them. She was, Gypsy Rose Lee. She was a very famous producer. She eventually became the stage gypsy based on her life. And she's very intelligent.
Well, I know it's people are always trying to relate to their family.
What?